Well, good morning. Already it's been an interesting morning for me to hear about the kind of work that you're doing and the public-private partnership that you're involved with. It also seems to be educational. It's public-spirited, but also you're trying to learn from each other, and it's actually quite an inspiring example, I think. I've been asked to speak a little bit about our present situation. And as I reflected on coming to Brazil for the first time and thinking about the extraordinary moment that my country is in right now and has been for the past couple of years, and the extraordinary moment that Brazil is now entering, it might be interesting to step back a little bit and discuss with you with a little historical distance what has happened in the United States from my point of view, thinking that might be useful for you in thinking about the era that you yourselves seem to be entering. I know it's a little early for a history lesson, but I'll make it short. I'll begin with a question. What can the history of the 20th century tell us about the problems that are affecting our democracies today? Now, for a long time, when we talked about the 20th century, what was it that we would talk about? Well, obviously, we would understandably focus on the most dramatic and violent events of that period, and then develop a narrative around them. And so we would begin this story with the First World War, move on to the Russian Revolution, the rise of Nazism, the Second World War, as if that's one episode. Then the next period in the 20th century was conceived as the consequence of those events in the early part of the century. And so one can include the Cold War, decolonization, revolutions in the Third World, Vietnam War. Now, of course, these narratives always leave something out, but these events had international and I think universal import. But I think as we get deeper into the 21st century, other events in the 20th century are coming to seem more important to us from our point of view today. For example, the steady rise of a finance-driven world economy after the Second World War, and various ideas, I'll use the word neoliberal ideas that celebrated that order, now seem quite important to us in a way they did not when we were living through those moments. They also offer us the opportunity to revisit the ideological landscape of the 20th century and compare it to our own. In the United States, there are a number of, or in English, there are a number of books on the 19th and 20th century that use the title, The Age of Ideologies. And that's understandable because ever since the French Revolution, world politics have been driven by conflicts not between economic systems, but between rival systems of political ideas. And those ideas came with grand historical narratives explaining how we got to where we are now. And the conflicts of those systems of ideas sparked real conflicts in the wars of the 20th century. But I think with some distance, it's now time and good time to remind ourselves that the dominant political ideas of the last century, communism, fascism, social democracy, actually shared something. Whatever else separated them, all three of these sets of political ideas presumed the importance of social solidarity, however they defined it. For Marxists, it meant class solidarity. For fascists, it meant national and racial solidarity. And for social democracy, it meant the solidarity of citizens within a welfare state. And so interestingly, now we can see that the great debates in the 20th century, intellectual battles, were not between ideologies of solidarity, let's say, and ideologies of individualism, but rather they were over what solidarity meant and means, and the legitimate means of securing it. And paradoxically, the military conflicts of the 20th century that arose from these battles of ideas actually increased the sense of solidarity among those who fought them. In the Soviet Union, for example, the heroic defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War became a source of national pride. Marx thought that national pride would disappear with communism, and it turned out it didn't. The successful revolutions in China and Cuba had the same effect for a while. In democratic Western Europe, though, the experience of war not only led to the expansion of welfare states, but it also triggered efforts to build cooperation among nations that had been rivals for centuries, an effort that culminated, as we know, in the European Union. In all these cases, the experience of collective struggle and danger overcome inspired people to identify with their states and to identify with their fellow citizens with a sense of duty and a sense of sacrifice. Now, the story in the United States was less dramatic, but similar. It begins earlier in the 1930s, when liberal Democrats, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, responded to the failure of American conservatives to confront the two great challenges of the time, economic collapse and the spread of fascism. Once in power, these New Deal Democrats developed our welfare state based on principles of democratic solidarity. And the principles of that, were articulated by President Roosevelt in a famous speech worth reading in any language called The Four Freedoms. And in that speech, Roosevelt declared that democracy depends on individual freedoms against government, so freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but it also depends on freedoms that require collective action through government. Those were freedom from poverty and freedom from fear. The experiences of the Depression, the New Deal, the wars against Germany and Japan made the American public receptive to Roosevelt's ideas. And in the post-war period, from Second World War until the 1980s, there was an unprecedented sense of unity in the United States, which hadn't existed previously. We were a much more individualistic country before that. And so the notion of solidarity made sense, and it determined the political debates of that period. But by the 1980s, it was clear that things were changing in the United States, as they were changing in all industrial and post-industrial democracies like your own. Not just ideas, but also social reality. After 3 decades of economic growth, family life changed. Our families changed. The urban landscape changed. For example, the mass of impoverished industrial workers that the Marxists would talk about, in fact, became bourgeois property owners with private homes and paid vacations. Residents of rural areas abandoned their small, close-knit communities, and they came to our anonymous cities. And once they got to the cities, they started driving around in these little bubbles we call automobiles, though in Sao Paulo, driving very slowly. Birth control and home technology freed up women to have fewer children, and independent youth culture undermined the authority of parents. Even before the invention of the internet, which we all complain about, all these developments were weakening the social bonds that once sustained democratic solidarity in all our countries. So it's not really surprising that neoliberal ideas celebrating this individualism would eventually arise. Nor is it surprising that dynamic leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan would be elected. If you read, often you'll hear on the left that these neoliberal leaders, Thatcher and Reagan, came to power through some kind of coup d'etat. Nobody actually wanted them. But in fact, they were popular leaders. And why were they popular? Because their ideas seemed to correspond to the new world people were living in, where they simply felt more independent of each other. The new middle class was now placing its hopes more in economic growth than in economic equality. And the government and our populations had become skeptical of the power of government, even the power of unions, to help. And so in the 1980s and 90s, it simply made sense to a great number of people in the United States, in Britain, in other countries, that one would try to liberalize the economy, shrink government, and the rest. And it all made sense until it didn't. And one reason it didn't is that these neoliberal ideas, however appropriate they may have been to the economic situation, actually atomized social life and made solidarity even more difficult to imagine. That's a universal phenomenon. But in the United States, there was something else that developed that I've learned has also developed here in Brazil. And that is a new atomizing ideology on the left, focusing on individual and group identity. And this development, which is the subject of my most recent book, was paradoxical in the extreme. Beginning in the 1950s, social movements developed in the United States that demanded equal rights for minorities, for African Americans, for gays and lesbians, and for non-minorities, women. But what was especially moving and effective about them was that their demands were made in the language of solidarity. All Americans, these groups claimed, deserved equal rights simply because they were U.S. citizens. And in order to achieve those rights in practice, these movements had to persuade the rest of America, white America, male America, straight America, to identify with them, which they eventually did. Not only have most of the legal rights for these groups been achieved, at least on paper, the United States, even under Donald Trump, is a far more open and tolerant country than it was a half century ago. And that's good news. But during the Reagan years, something changed on the left, and I'm seeing that it's changed on the left here as well. The rhetoric shifted from the language of equality among citizens to a language of personal identity. In other words, a shift from a principle of solidarity to a principle of self-definition and recognition. And the repercussions for our politics were profound. It's one thing, for example, to call for gays and lesbians to be treated equally by law. It's a different thing to say, you must accept and affirm the way I define myself. And this kind of identity politics implies a very different picture of what a democracy is. That it's not a union of equal citizens, but it is simply an agglomeration of individuals and groups with separate identities, separate tribes that share nothing in common. Many young people today, not just in the United States, think about our societies, our democratic societies, in this light. They do not think of themselves primarily as citizens. They think of themselves as private individuals possessing a unique identity that sets them off from people with other identities. This is why they're so offended. This is why there is political correctness in universities and media. It's also why, it's interesting if you know, I'm not sure it's the same in Brazil, but that young people today in the United States tend to limit their political engagements to issues that only affect how they define their identities, and they have no interest in the rest. For someone like myself who grew up during the Cold War, the ideological battles then demanded that we had to know something about everything. It was a time in the 1970s where we all thought we had these ideologies that explained everything: history, economics, sociology, politics, sexuality, the rest. And the idea of being engaged in politics, many of you, in intellectual debate with me, required having to know something about all these things. Now, there was a problem with these grand ideologies, but at least they inspired us to look at the big picture. So now we find ourselves in many countries, this is certainly true in Europe as well, with an odd left and an odd right. The left in the United States opposes economic neoliberalism, but it supports what you might call social neoliberalism, which is identity politics. Its primary aim is not to build solidarity, but to reinforce the radical individualism of our time. Again, this shouldn't surprise us much. The intellectual and material forces in our societies, the fact that we live differently, that we have the economy that we have, makes it harder for us to identify with our fellow citizens or to engage in shared efforts for the common good. In the United States, identity politics has become the Reaganism of the American left. And it is spreading in Europe, and I've learned in the past year it's spreading in Latin America. By now, I think, if we look clearly at our situation, the effects on our society are apparent. The effects of economic globalization, especially in the financial sector, has destabilized governments all over the world. In every country, it's widened the gap between an educated elite on the one hand, and on the other hand, a growing resentful underclass of people without education and without skills. And uncontrolled immigration has made those people even angrier. Social neoliberalism, on the other hand, has also affected us psychologically. Young people are postponing marriage longer and longer, or choosing simply to live alone. Rates of depression and suicide are rising, especially among the young. This is not because our young people lack wealth or opportunity, though some may. It's because they, like the rest of us, are living more alone. We are becoming what the French writer Michel Houellebecq calls in his terrifying novels, elementary particles. I think it's because of all of these developments that it's hard today to avoid the sense that our democratic societies everywhere are unraveling. Governments are unable to control economic globalization or illegal immigration, which makes them look weak and ineffectual. That leads voters to reject those leaders and vote for another party, which promises to deal with these things. That party is not able to deal with them because no one has good answers. The result, though, is that voters become dissatisfied with democracy itself. What we're facing is not just the rise of a new right. What we're facing, or a new left in certain countries, in Mexico, for example, What we're facing is a dissatisfaction with democracy itself under the pressure of all the forces that I've been talking about this morning. People in our societies are finding harder and harder to identify with each other as citizens in order to cope with these challenges. As recent elections show, my country is split between two tribes who deeply distrust each other. On the one side, an educated, liberal, cosmopolitan elite that stresses personal identity, has contempt for religion, and is comfortable with multiculturalism. The tribe on the right brings together people who are less educated, more religious, and more white and male than the rest of the country. They feel the contempt of cultural elites, us. They feel contempt from us. And therefore, they begin asserting their own identity as the people who are not educated, the people who are religious. They develop their own identity politics as a group. And when you have this situation of distrust of elites, distrust of science, embrace of not very rational religion, that is when populists enter the scene. Because populists are able to convince those people in this less educated class that you are the people, not them. You're the genuine people. So no longer are we talking about all of us being citizens. You have one real people set against these outsiders, this cultural elite, convinced that their country's been stolen from them by politicians, by the media, by intellectuals. This radical American right now controls every level of government in the United States, particularly in the vast center of the country. And leading us all is a demonically talented demagogue who accumulates power by setting Americans against each other. So what can be done? Well, in the long term, I think we need somehow, and this would be a forum to talk about it, to rediscover the virtues of citizenship as a democratic idea and as an element of our political rhetoric. This is a very realistic proposal. This is not an idealistic one. Our societies are genuinely more diverse today, more diverse racially, more diverse in terms of gender, but also more diverse in terms of class because of this new class divide. But it's also a fact that we lead more individualistic lives than our parents did. Yet it is another fact that our destinies are joined. There is a common good out there that needs to be discovered, needs to be protected for all our sakes. We are not just tribes. We are not just elementary particles. We share a destiny in our democratic societies. And if we're to call people to protect it, we must rely not on an aspiration, but on a fourth social fact. And that is that whatever our differences or tribes, we are, on paper, citizens. We're born citizens or we're naturalized citizens, and therefore deserve to be treated as equal ones. Bearing in mind that being a citizen is not just about having rights, it's about having duties as well. The word that has dropped out of American politics in the age of, on the one hand, neoliberalism, and on the other hand, identity politics, is the word duty. When a generation that had gone through the Great Depression and World War II finally got to the 1950s, they had a sense of duty to their country and duty to their fellow citizens. But in an age that is increasingly individualistic, how do you persuade people that they have a duty towards others and not just their rights. This is hard. But if we talk about citizenship, we can begin, I think, to at least have a language for talking about why it is that we might owe things to each other and not simply have rights. That's for the very long term. But in the short term, I'm not sure anything can be done. Apart from trying to really understand how we got here. There's so many stories about how we got here, but we need to understand it better. We have to come to grips with the deep historical forces that have undermined civic feeling and a sense of solidarity among democratic citizens everywhere. Sustaining civic feeling is very difficult in the best of circumstances, which is why, from the ancient world to the present, democracies have always been weak. They've always suffered from a kind of entropy. The only thing that holds together democracies is a sense of citizenship, a bond. And when that bond breaks or is allowed to weaken, things begin to fall apart, and we're all feeling this. Take, for example, Eastern Europe, a particularly tragic situation. Within a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, democratic institutions were established throughout Eastern Europe. And we were all celebrating ourselves by saying, now we've entered the democratic age, look how easy it is. All we have to do is set up these institutions. But what the founders of these institutions could not do was establish a sense of shared citizenship among people who had just lived under communism. That's the work of generations. And now we see countries like Poland and Hungary embracing and even celebrating what Hungarian President Viktor Orban, a new friend of your soon-to-be president, calls illiberal democracy. Political forces are there in Italy, Austria, France, and they're forming a new popular front being organized by an American far-right figure, Steve Bannon. There's a new popular front now on the right. It's hard not to feel we've seen this movie before. To sum up, democracies without democrats do not last. They decay. They become oligarchy, they become theocracy, they become ethnic nationalism, tribalism, or authoritarian countries. I am not exaggerating when I say that there are signs of each and every one of these pathologies in American democratic life today. And it saddens me to think that Brazil may soon be suffering from the same illnesses that we do. Thank you.